Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 KCLA annual address. You'll have just been watching a brief introduction to what KCLA is and what it does, and a list of some of our past distinguished speakers for this event. So I'm going to move on straight away to introducing our distinguished speaker for this evening, Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, who's going to address the subject of the future of the Western Alliance. Professor Freedman is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, having been Professor of War Studies from 1982 to 2014. He additionally served as Vice Principal from 2003 to 2013. Before joining King's, Professor Freedman had held positions at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and the Royal Institute for International Affairs. He's taught, researched and written widely on international history, strategic theory, nuclear weapons and international security. And he's a globally respected academic in his field. He's been described as the Dean of British Strategic Studies. But most importantly for me, I think Professor Freedman's achieved much wider recognition well beyond academia as an authoritative commentator on international security issues through regular participation in media and his accessible and approachable writing on strategy and current affairs issues. Laurie was a key foreign policy advisor to Tony Blair, contributing to the preparation of the 1999 Chicago speech, in which Tony Blair set out the Blair doctrine of international community. There is such a community, I think I summarise. He was appointed a Privy Councillor and also the official historian for the Falklands campaign, producing a highly readable official history. And he served as a member of the official inquiry into Britain and the 2003 Iraq War, the Chilcot Review. A CBE in 1996 was followed by a knighthood in 2003, and in 2006 he was awarded the prestigious Chesney Gold Medal by the Royal United Services Institution to mark a lifelong of distinguished contribution to defence and international security fields. He's received many other national and international awards, and they really are too numerous to list. In turbulent times, Professor Freedman's been my go-to authority to try to understand what has happened in international security, what is happening, and where it's likely to take us. I cannot think of anyone better to now speak on the topic of the future of the Western Alliance. Laurie's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and there will be time for questions at the end. So if you would like to ask a question, please put it into the chat, and I, with colleagues, will pick that up. Now, Laurie, welcome to the address and welcome this evening, and it's over to you.
Diana, thanks very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a shame not to be with you all in person. I was looking forward to seeing lots of old friends and colleagues. But here we are, hopefully next time. I'm going to talk about the Western Alliance, which itself is a term that's become a bit contentious, mainly because it's geographically dubious now. It's not just in the West, but we sort of know what we mean. And it's essentially, we're talking about the liberal democracies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific regions, who also have close ties to the United States, close security ties to the United States. And so it's important to understand from the start that when we're talking about the Western Alliance, we're talking about something that is both an ideological and a geopolitical construct. And these two aspects depend upon each other, which is part of the point of my lecture this evening. The reason why it's a propitious time, necessary time to talk about this, and I have to say throughout my career it's been a pretty regular topic, but it's widely assumed that the Alliance has taken something of a battering over the course of this century, not just in recent months, and is not in good shape. And we can all think of the reasons why this will be so: the deep divisions over the Iraq War, frustrations over an operation which was supported by a degree of consensus, which was Afghanistan, but the awkward withdrawal a few months ago conveyed a sense of failure and disarray. On the economic side, we can go back to the financial crisis, 2009-10, the impact of such events as the Trump presidency, arguably Brexit, which challenged, to say the least, established structures, conventions, and practices. And while this has been going on, and what the West has tried to do has often struggled, the leading opponents of the West, and people tend to point to Russia and China and occasionally Iran, but I'll concentrate on Russia and China in this role, seem to have made strides. Russia took a bit of Ukraine in 2014 and established a toehold in a bit more. And China, of course, has turned itself into an economic juggernaut and is challenging the United States for top position in the international hierarchy. All of this, we're still struggling with the effects of COVID, especially now as a fourth wave seems to be hitting Europe, just as the combination of the waning of the vaccine effectiveness and the Delta variant attracting more victims. So it's not a good time. Now, there's lots of different things coming and issues and processes coming together here, but I want to focus on the core ideology that underpins the Western Alliance, liberalism, and try to explain why that is in crisis. But I'll also try to explain why illiberalism has its own crises. Liberalism is the surviving ideology of the post-Enlightenment era. It's embraced in a variety of forms by members of the Western Alliance. The essence of liberalism is to distrust arbitrary and unaccountable power, focus on the individual over the collective, and respect science over dogma. Beyond that, it often lacks coherence because it includes many competing strands, as I'll demonstrate in a moment. It describes partisan positions as much as an underlying ideology, which is why not all of those who accept its core precepts identify as liberals. In the United States, for example, liberalism is often seen to be almost as tantamount to socialism, and liberal democracy is recognized as a theme in most Western countries. Often they don't describe themselves as that. But that's not the reason it's in crisis, why there's a problem. At the turn of this century, liberalism appeared to be ascendant, having triumphed over Nazism in the Second World War and then communism in the Cold War. There was even talk of a liberal international order, offering the promise of a more harmonious system based on shared values, open trade, and multilateral endeavors. Liberalism's sphere of influence grew as its perspectives permeated international institutions and they acquired more members and power. After the end of the Cold War, NATO and the European Union expanded, obliging new members, often former adversaries, to embrace the rule of law and honor human rights. Globalization raised hopes that countries would follow common standards and embrace shared values, thereby reducing the risk of conflict and facilitating trade and free movement. It's striking to recall that wasn't that long ago that China was to be welcomed into the World Trade Organization on the basis that its role in such an organization would encourage liberalism and democracy to grow within China. So we were hoping for a virtuous circle as the political and economic reinforced each other. As people, commerce, and finance move freely around the world, so would ideas. Conflicts would lose their rougher edges, and we'd all become more prosperous. And it's worth recalling too that the 1990s got off in this respect to a promising start. Apartheid ended, and there were bold moves to address the Israeli occupation of Palestine. In first the Gulf, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, and then in the Balkans the next year, as the former Yugoslavia began to fall apart. Despite these troubles, the UN Security Council began to work as its founders intended. It passed numerous resolutions. Russia and the United States, with Britain and France, worked pretty closely together. And on that basis, towards the end of the first Gulf War, President George H. Bush, first President Bush, declared a new world order. In fact, it was a world order that was essentially how things were supposed to have worked. The last time a new world order had been declared in 1945. As the decade progressed, there was a consensus that shared problems required collective action, whether development, climate change, or even the humanitarian distress caused by wars. The previous assumption that there should never be interference in internal affairs, which protected the rights of a liberal state, began to be put aside in a series of humanitarian interventions. When we didn't intervene, as in Rwanda, terrible things continued. But when we did, for example, Kosovo or Sierra Leone, we seemed to make things better. Diana mentioned the Chicago speech of April 99, which was, despite my hand in drafting, nonetheless still Tony Blair's speech. It's important to note that that speech it wasn't a carte blanche for intervention. In fact, if you read it, people are often quite surprised by how restrictive it was. What it did, it was set up tests for future interventions on were there military feasible options, were we sure of our case, had we exhausted diplomacy, were we ready for the long term, did it serve national interest, that one can still debate and find useful today. But the important thing was it presumed that the pattern of the 90s would continue into the next century. Now, this all seems a long time ago. The optimism of that first post-Cold War decade seems rather naive now, while the routines of multilateralism have become rather tired and ineffectual. COP26 does not seem to me to have been a failure, but it was hard work. And the fact that key states such as China stepped outside of it was still an indication of the limits to a new multilateral order. Even with that, we would still have to come to terms with the possibility that liberalism is now in retreat, reflected in a decline in the number of governments that respect basic freedoms. And this is perhaps mostly, well, not only a concern, but certainly a significant concern in the EU and NATO as institutions which stress the importance of human rights and the rule of law, when members of those organizations are now backsliding and often seeming to embrace authoritarian practices. Meanwhile, brittle regimes act with impunity, and there's little appetite or capacity to stop them. There isn't a global order, liberal or otherwise. That would require either a hegemon or a durable balance of power, and we haven't either of those. The West is not able to force others to follow its lead, and while it can balance China for the moment, there's no indication that China has any particular interest in being balanced. This isn't a two-way thing. During the Cold War, you could demonstrate, I think, that both the United States and the Soviet Union understood the nature of the balance of terror and nuclear weapons and accepted the need to work together to manage the international system. Now, there's still, and for good reason, a fear of a calamitous major war among great powers, and that will continue to have a dampening effect on conflict into the future, though how much is uncertain. But it doesn't stop the system being reshaped by the leading illiberal states, notably China and Russia. They're the ones taking the initiative, especially China, I think, in the South China Seas, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is giving it sort of footholds in a large number of countries, and the pressure it's putting on Taiwan. And the question for members of the Western Alliance is not whether they can design and implement a better global order now, but whether the current self-doubting liberalism is sufficient to bind them together. And as I noted, even the term Western Alliance is now contested because of its geographic bias. The crisis, I'd argue, reflects tensions between the different strands of liberalism. One tension is between the desire to strengthen international law and institutions to prevent recourse to war as a way of resolving disputes on the one hand, and on the other hand, the belief that forceful action is at times necessary to protect all people from the ravages of illiberalism as a contrary challenge. On one hand, liberalism has been anti-war. On the other hand, against the bad guys, it's been prepared to go to war. The second tension is between a belief in free markets and competition as a source of productive efficiency and prosperity, reflecting the individualism at the heart of liberalism, but also the need, the need to protect corporations acquiring monopoly power, the need to intervene in markets to prevent corporations acquiring monopoly power, to guard against socially inflammatory inequalities, and to ensure that collective needs are met. So again, liberalism has been pro-market and anti-state, but then sees the need for the state to come in to regulate markets. I think what we could see coming into this century was that the more ambitious versions of both of these strands were to the fore. It was more interventionist in taking on the bad guys, and it was more confident in the value of free markets and competition as against regulation. Now, I think what's happened is in both these cases, these strands became discredited because of excessive hubris and ambition. On the economic side, money was bundled into ever more esoteric financial instruments that became progressively detached from real productive economic activity. And the legacy was a black mark against modern capitalist practices, as ordinary people were left suffering the consequences, and still do, losing confidence in the political establishment and providing fertile grounds for new populist movements, sometimes of the left, largely of the right. Established institutions and values came to be challenged by political forces that disdained them and treated them with contempt. COVID-19, I think, threw into sharp relief then the problems caused by globalization, not only the spread of disease, the ease of contemporary travel, but also the dependence on supply chains, which soon became badly disrupted. On the foreign policy side, there was always a problem with engagements with an outside world that invariably requires compromises with illiberalism. The Blair government began with promises about an ethical foreign policy, but almost as soon as one is announced, there's going to be accusations of hypocrisy and double standards, because questions of trade, security, come up against the fact that you need to deal with states that are illiberal. For example, so long as we're dependent upon fossil fuels for at least one chunk of our energy, we're going to have to have decent relations with the Gulf monarchies. or have to work out how we deal with Russia, as we're seeing at the moment. But we're not very good at adopting a more realist rhetoric, explaining that things have to be done to protect energy supplies or trade. It sounds cynical. We want it to appear that at all times we're acting according to our values, even if this means sometimes setting unrealistic goals. Thus, the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, which didn't start as liberal ventures, were nonetheless recast in that way. Afghanistan was prompted by concerns about terrorism, Osama bin Laden. Iraq, although the rationale was soon discredited, it was believed at the time by concerns about proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. They became seen as liberal projects, not only because they took on such liberal figures as Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, but also because of the effort to turn those countries, once the regimes had been overthrown, into functioning liberal democracies. Unfortunately, occupations are inherently illiberal activities, especially when they must be sustained against hostile and well-supported local political movements. The return of the Taliban last summer, which had been on the cards for some time and was largely the result of the deal done by President Trump in 2020, nonetheless came to be seen to mark the end of this particular project, and even a stage in Western grand strategy. Western governments might still be ready to take on Islamist terrorism directly, especially if their activists could be targeted directly using drones, but there was no longer any interest in inserting ground forces into a long and indecisive counterinsurgency campaign. In that sense, the key lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan were learned a decade ago. Even though military action could still take place as long as somebody else was providing the infantry, as for example in the campaigns against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So the awkward dependencies created by unrestricted globalization and the pain caused by ill-conceived interventions has led to retrenchment. Instead of now addressing the issues raised by problems being faced by fragile and vulnerable states, foreign policy has come to be dominated since by more defensive questions of how to address the harsher stances taken by Russia and China. A return to great power competition is now described as the defining feature of the 2020s. And with such competition comes the inevitable questions about the role of the US as the source of security guarantees to the liberal democracies. And this is the point where the ideological side of the Western alliance and the geopolitical side come together. As the strategists assess potential responses to, say, a Russian move into a Baltic state or even fully into Ukraine, or a Chinese assault on Taiwan, they soon come to the big realist questions. Will the United States really bring its military power to bear in these scenarios? What should a state that is not directly at risk from aggression do in these circumstances? Why should it throw itself into a dangerous conflict, especially one that might conclude with nuclear exchanges? This is not a new question. It was first raised as soon as the Soviet Union acquired its own nuclear capability in the 1950s. And the alliance has coped perfectly well for many years simply by avoiding a definitive answer. The credibility of extended nuclear deterrence has long kept debates in NATO lively and ongoing. And eventually they've been sorted, not so much by demonstrating the credibility of a nuclear riposte to any aggression, but because you could never be certain that one would not be forthcoming. It's not that nuclear escalation would ever necessarily seem as a sensible thing to do. It probably wouldn't. But you couldn't rule out that nonetheless it might occur. The risk of there being a nuclear war was sufficient for everybody to be cautious and circumspect. And you can argue that in a way, nuclear deterrence has been reinforced by conventional deterrence. By this, I mean that although there's a lot of talk now about preparing for a next great power war between, using the jargon, peer competitors across the multi-domains, actually we've no idea what a conventional war would look like anymore, because it's a long time since we fought one on scale. You go back to the Arab-Israeli wars or the Indo-Pakistan wars of the early 70s, or even the Falklands. But after that, you get very little idea about how modern weaponry, which now includes all the cyber and space and so on elements, would work and interact. To take one obvious example, things are very digitized these days, talk of artificial intelligence. But what happens if very early on in the conflict, all your networks go down? There's tremendous uncertainties about how you would actually fight a future war. And that is why you tend to see a lot of talk these days about so-called gray area conflict. But what they mean by this is that instead of using force, armed force, which often unnecessarily is described as being kinetic, there's a reliance on such things as economic sanctions, cyber attacks, forms of sabotage essentially, and information campaigns using Twitter and Facebook as means of pursuing grievances and highlighting disputes. These are certainly less dangerous than what has gone before, but they do have the effect of adding irritants and grit into the system, while not leading to the resolution of any of the underlying conflicts. So what we have with this grey area is essentially a situation in which the conflict doesn't go away. We see it there, we feel it there. And the means by which we conduct it, the conflict is handled, tend to encourage it to continue, but they don't provide a means of some surrender of one side or the basis of a grand negotiation to put everything onto a different basis. We just have this sort of continual bad-tempered levels of engagement that don't solve very much. So that's how we continue with the overhang of this question of whether security guarantees mean very much, should they have to be cashed in. And when you have issues coming to the fore, whether on the borders of Russia or with Taiwan, they inevitably get asked again, because maybe a moment will come when these promises will be tested, and the question of deterrence will have to be revisited. We don't know who's bluffing and who's not bluffing. And when these questions are raised, inevitably, you're going to be asking questions about why should we? And most questions of why should we bring us back to these questions of values. We'll do more to protect a country that seems to share our basic values and on whom, to some extent, we depend as well as questions of consideration of other sorts of interests. matters. Severity of threat to core values in the way of life matters. And that's why the crisis in liberalism matters. If the alliance don't appear to be in good order, with mutual suspicions and stark policy differences, then there will be more queries about the reliability of solemn obligations and rhetorical commitments undertaken in happier times. Long before the most testing moments, these queries could erode cohesion even more. Hence the anxiety that behind much of the current commentary on the durability of alliance, that ties of interest and ideology will not be sufficient to hold it together as they come under pressure, the concern that we may even start to see the whole thing unravel. So against the very optimistic prognosis with which this century started, this is a rather gloomy prognosis. It seems to me there are three counters. The first thus is that in practice, if anything, alliance activity has intensified in recent years. The heightened competition has reinforced rather than undermined the Western alliance. Russia's hostile stance towards Ukraine, including annexing Crimea in 2014, reminded NATO of its original purpose at a time when the Afghan experience had sown doubts about a more expansive role. Meanwhile, China's assertiveness, taken to a new level by Xi Jinping, has led to a reaction amongst countries in the Indo-Pacific region, with new life being injected into some rather weak international institutions, such as the Quad, involving Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, and the unexpected development of a new partnership, AUKUS, Australia, UK, and US, as a technology partnership with an initial focus on nuclear submarines. So if you look at the Pacific, you would see there was much more alliance activity stirred up by China rather than the alliance fading away. And this has taken shape despite doubts about whether the United States is ready and willing to sustain its established alliances. President Trump was skeptical of their value as well as free trade. Biden has taken a much more traditional stance, although the abrupt departure from Afghanistan led to his readiness to concern about his readiness to consult before making major moves. Over the long term, it seems to me there are real questions about the implications should Trump win the 2024 election, and indeed whether, with its degree of internal polarization, the US can remain a liberal state. Everything I'm talking about, I think, depends on the US being able to lead in the future on the basis of its own liberal democracy. Nonetheless, for the moment, Biden has reaffirmed the value of existing alliances, and you could argue, at least superficially, in terms of their activity and indeed new formations, they're stronger than ever. The second counter to the gloom follows Winston Churchill's observation: there is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that's fighting without them. The US is at the center of a complex web of security arrangements with some 70 states. By contrast, Russia and China are relatively friendless, with a few client states that are themselves relatively weak. They have no one to work with on the generality of foreign policy issues, other than, on occasion, each other. And this has led to a tentative alliance of convenience between the two, as they both seek to undermine the Western position. But it's asymmetrical. China now is a much stronger country than Russia. And it's not based on any natural affinity. Until the end of the 80s, the two were as wary of each other than they were of the US. All they have is a shared illiberalism. Russia is stuck in East Ukraine, and while it can claim success in keeping Assad in power in Syria, it lacks the resources to support any sort of Syrian recovery. China's Belt and Road Initiative has yielded far less than anticipated because of poorly designed infrastructure projects and issues with debt. Its so-called wolf warrior diplomacy and efforts to intimidate states that question Chinese policies, for example, Australia, which was got into an argument with Beijing because of its demands for a proper investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. Actually, Australia, if anything, has come out better from that than China. The third point, which is, I guess, a more ideological one, is that liberalism does not produce better or more efficient government than liberalism, or at least offers its own special dysfunctions. Illiberalism is offered as a critique of Western decadence and incoherence. Authoritarianism promises incisive and decisive decision-making without needing to take account of any opposition or bother with complex legal processes. China's remarkable economic progress over the past 3 decades has been taken to show that authoritarianism does not preclude growth and prosperity, although much of this took place while the country was more open than it is now and was not caught up in a cult of personality. As Xi has sought to extend control over the developing problems, content his control, the developing problems with the Chinese model have become more apparent, including rapidly aging population, environmental degradation, and an economy distorted by a rush for growth. Moreover, illiberalism generates its own perverse paranoid logic. If no diversity of opinion can be tolerated, then as each boundary is reached, control must be extended and dissent squashed. Anything that can't be controlled becomes potentially threatening. Yet if individuals and groups lack outlets for their grievances and dissatisfaction, then elite discourse becomes sycophantic to a supreme leader, and it becomes harder to identify emerging problems and make the case for policy shifts, especially if these are seen as criticisms of the great leader. Now, this is obviously not to argue that China is on the verge of collapse, but is entering a period when its system will face some severe challenges, which may be aggravated as a result of its inflexible and coercive character. As this is not a model that others could emulate, even if they wanted to, for example, in its high technology social control, then should its reputation for effortless progress be further dented, then it will be even less likely to form a counter alliance to the West. Illiberalism, therefore, has its own crises. Russia and China face serious policy dilemmas, and their systems, including their entrenched leadership, do not always lead them to choose wisely. Let me just briefly, before I conclude, underline the point by looking at social media campaigns, because this is often mentioned as a particular vulnerability of the West. Sort of narrative wars where the access to Twitter and Facebook is one of the factors undermining liberalism. And I'm just going to make one point, it might be something that's worth taking up in questions, but it reflects a tendency to identify an awful lot of Russian and Chinese, in fact, matter Iranian activity without bothering to evaluate whether it's successful or not. And just to give you one example, in July 2014, the Russians shot down the MH17 Malaysian airliner with many casualties. It's pretty obvious what had happened on the day, that this had been through a Russian surface-to-air missile that had been used by the rebels on behalf of the rebels in Ukraine. And if it had been acknowledged, as the Iranians did not that long ago when they shot down a Ukrainian plane, then the issue would have been regrettable and tragic, but it would be forgotten by now. Yet the various efforts by Russia to demonstrate that the obvious thing was not what happened and that it was a Ukrainian plane that shot down the airliner, or there was some other conspiracy afoot, have failed completely, which is why a number of people are in trial at the moment in The Hague in their absence for the tragedy. Look at another example when with the Skripals in Salisbury, the Russian efforts to deny their responsibility ended in derision. Or just my final point, another example, the anti-vaccination campaigns waged by Russia in the West, encouraged by Russia in the West, seems to have taken root far more in Russia than in the West. Very little. I mean, there are problems with vaccinations we're seeing at the moment here, but the problems are even greater in Russia, and even China is struggling to get a grip. So what's my conclusion? If it's the case that liberalism, illiberalism will struggle, then maybe liberalism should do better. It's of course important to note that we have had serious troubles, not created by, often suggested by Russian information campaigns, but Trump and Brexit or whatever, reflected what divisions of opinion within our own countries, and this is partly our challenge. But liberalism has traditionally been better at adapting to new circumstances, acknowledging the problems with existing policies, and gathering diverse evidence and approaches on alternative positions. It still leaves liberalism in a defensive position after a series of missteps over the past few days. There are major economic and social problems to be addressed, exacerbated by the pandemic. Illiberal political movements are strong in some Western states, most dangerously in the US. Addressing these issues still leaves the standard concerns of alliances, clarifying interests, identifying threats, maintaining trust, building strength, and coping with unexpected events. So recovery from the crisis in liberalism will not be straightforward, certainly can't be guaranteed. But if it is to happen, a good starting point will be to take advantage of the qualities that allowed liberalism to recover from its past reverses, its openness to fresh thinking, peaceful transfers of power to new leaders, and pragmatism in policy making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurie. There's so much in there for us to think about. I have to say, listening to you was quite, in a sense, quite depressing. So I wonder whether in our liberal societies we have lost a way to be outward facing as well. I mean, many of the debates in the UK are very inward looking, and it seems to me that part of the ability to not talk about our place in the world is that we've actually stopped talking about our place in the world.
Yes, no. I mean, after all, I mean, the big event in this country over the last few weeks was COP26 in Glasgow, in which, however you felt about how it was developed, I don't think the British chairmanship was that bad, and it was prominent. What's been going on in the Asia Pacific has shown the UK more engaged. I think, though, it's always the case that you sort of need a project. I mean, climate change, I think, is one. But one of the features of the UK, after all, is its geographical position is pretty good. If you look where we actually are located in the world. So you don't have the same edge that you get in other places where the threats to borders are actually much more severe, and you have to look beyond the borders on a more regular basis. The most we get is the sort of spats with France over asylum seekers or the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I don't think I think there's more of a barrier to be overcome. When we had empire, obviously everywhere in the world was of interest to the UK, and we had experts in everywhere in the world. One of the consequences of the loss of empire is you don't have interests everywhere in the world, and therefore it's harder to pay attention. You need a project, and that's, in the past, we tended to get our projects from the United States. That's what the Special Alliance was all about. The start of the Cold War, the middle of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, post-Cold War, humanitarian intervention, and so on. So actually, a lot of that depends on how engaged the Americans are going to be, and I think that's an open question, given the battering their politics has taken over the last 5 years.
Very good. Now we have a question here from somebody who, have I got their name? Laura Simonian, who I think you've taught, or she's certainly been at lectures. Her question is about the South Caucasus region and the West, and the failure of the West to step in, and the consequences. What consequences can the West withdraw from the diplomatic table in the South Caucasus have in terms of global impact, and how does the West consider Turkey in this process?
Yes, it's an important question, and I think it's one of the issues. So while we've become preoccupied with China and to a degree Russia, we've tended to focus very much on core questions. That is our own borders and the obvious flashpoints like Taiwan. And so a lot has been going on, straight with Armenia and Azerbaijan, which is still going on, and much in the Middle East, which we're just not engaged with in the way we would have been in the past. And powers such as Turkey and Russia are now moving in, but they're not moving in necessarily with great confidence and certainty. These are really intractable issues. So I think it's a fair point that it's one of the consequences of what I've been describing, that in the past, I mean, the United States would have just have been in there. The American Secretary of State would have been ringing people up, and there'd been meetings in the Security Council, and they'd be to the fore in trying to sort it out. And the British and the French and others would have been there too. But it all seems a bit difficult, so we haven't. I mean, you can argue that there's things going on in the West Balkans, for example, at the moment, where the same phenomenon, that things that don't seem to be an absolutely high priority are being let pass, and this can be very dangerous. So it's part of the erosion of Western influence, and it's not compensation, it's not a mitigation, just to note that it does, because we're not engaged as we might have been. Those who are engaged don't necessarily find these things easier to deal with, that they are, as we found, often pretty intractable problems. I mean, there's issues between Greece and Turkey, which are the sort that can't be ignored, and which do have the potential to be very divisive within the Western alliance. France has just signed up a very special defence arrangement with Greece, though they're both members of the EU and NATO. And Germany has strong ties with Turkey. You can start to see problems.
Thank you. I've got a question from Stephen Chalacombe here. It says, thank you. Great overview of how difficult it is for liberal democracies to act in the global interest. If it came to it, where's it gone? If it came to it, should the West protect Taiwan from China or the Ukraine from Russia?
I think so. I think that at the moment, if we just take each in turn. I mean, the first point is obviously that Taiwan can do an awful lot to protect itself. The Taiwanese describe themselves as an indigestible porcupine, which is a sort of term I like. I mean, and the Chinese, and this isn't like Hong Kong. I mean, where the Chinese already held structures of power within Hong Kong, which made its takeover, which I personally find absolutely tragic, but made it possible. With Taiwan, they'd have to move and they'd face resistance. And it would be a maritime conflict, and it's not just the US. It's Australia, India, Japan, and so on, all would have a stake in China failing in this. And I think China knows that. I think there's a big debate as to whether or not Xi believes time is running out, which it might be on the one hand in terms of the difficulties his own country may face, and the build-up he's still trying to complete in his armed forces. So I don't think one should dismiss the scenarios, because it matters enormously to China. And should Taiwan definitively end the one China policy by declaring independence, say, then Xi would certainly be on the spot. That would be a dangerous situation. But if the Taiwanese continue to play it cannily, I think it should be manageable. The problem the Russians have in Ukraine is in a way similar. They would get bogged down there. They've, even in the bits of Ukraine they've taken, leave aside Crimea, where they had quite a bit of support, but in Donetsk and Luhansk, they're stuck. And you have these regular scares, annual scares about Russian troops on the border. And I think they are nervous that NATO countries are doing more to support Ukraine at the moment. But the risks for Putin of a major clash are enormous, partly because he doesn't particularly want to fight with a real fight with the West, and secondly, because the Ukrainians wouldn't roll over. And there are very deep memories in Ukraine about past Russian treatment going back to the famines of the 30s. So I wouldn't, again, you can't rule out miscalculations, misapprehensions, or whatever. It's always foolish to say something won't happen. One of the reasons things don't happen is people stay on their guard and prepared. But I wouldn't be over gloomy about the risks.
Thank you, Laurie. And I've got just picking up that China environment as well. Question here from Bruno Rees. Great to hear from you, even if virtually. Many good points. But to focus on one China also has weaknesses too. But how strong is China militarily relative to the West? And can we know with some certainty? Should European powers focus on moving militarily to Far East, or making sure there are no strategic voids emerging in Africa, in the Mediterranean, even in the Atlantic, where China is increasingly present?
Hi, Bruno. Good to hear from you. So China has been putting a lot of effort and developing more of a global presence, which is why the mentions of the Mediterranean, which one doesn't normally think of as being a Chinese area, but they've certainly become more present. I think for China, there is a risk that is spreading itself quite thinly in some areas. And the Belt and Road Initiative hasn't made it as popular as it thought it would, and it's controversial within Beijing now. I wouldn't be surprised to see a degree of pulling back. It has, however, been making major investments, especially in its navy, which was barely existent not that long ago. One of the problems China has, in some ways not to its discredit, is that it hasn't actually been at war since 1979. That was a pretty unimpressive short campaign against Vietnam. So it doesn't really know, it hasn't got the experience. And especially with the maritime capability, it's not that easy to fight wars at sea. So I think it's something that does require attention. And I think one of the interesting things, like measures such as the Quad, is you're bringing to bear not just American maritime strength, but Japan, that is easily underestimated as a military power, along with India, which has got its own controversial contested border with India. I mean, India doesn't contest it, China does. And I think the problem for China is that it hasn't, said in my lecture, it doesn't quite know where to stop. It can't concede an inch. Hasn't been very good under this regime. It's been perfectly fine under previous ones, of working out how to draw a line over an issue and move on to something else. It feels that with its economic success and developing power, it should be respected by everybody, and doesn't quite know how to deal with the fact that it isn't. So I think this is why the Party Congress next year is going to be very interesting. Why it shouldn't be assumed that Xi is going to be able to dominate all the debates, although at the moment his position looks pretty unassailable, because he has stretched China's geopolitical horizons, and I'm not sure if this is sustainable in the long term.
Thank you. In the same area, I've got a question here from Paul Ogden on the future. What does the future look like for Japan? Their defence is at the whim of the US presidents. Their demographics are terrible, and their neighbours are very unfriendly thanks to their 20th century episodes.
I think Japan is a bit more self-sufficient than that suggests. I mean, its demographics are certainly not very good, but nor are China's, probably slightly worse, and Russia's. I think there has been a real problem in the legacy of the war looms large still, and that's not just Japan and China. That's Japan and South Korea as well, two countries that should be natural allies. And we haven't talked about North Korea and the fact that that's not a solved problem either. And North Korea is a pretty desperate state at the moment because of famine and COVID and so on and so forth. And as you just away from Japan, but just one point always worth keeping in mind is that however much one can prognosticate about the future, it's always events and places that you weren't looking hard at that cause you problems. And there's a lot of potential instability in the region. Japan, I don't think, is unstable. I think the relations between Australia and Japan and the US and Japan are not in bad shape at all, India and Japan. But there are still the issues. And I think it's true. I mean, start with women of the US. Yeah, I don't think that's wholly the case, but it remains the case that it's hard to imagine any alliances in the Indo-Pacific region working well for very long if the US is absent. You need the US engaged in a sensible and pragmatic but resolute way. Europe, it's slightly different, but more complicated in some ways. But there is a thing that the countries of Europe are in the habit of working more closely together. That's not true of the countries of the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you. I'm going to try and, just over 7 o'clock, I'm going to try and draw this to an end. Laurie, I'm going to finish with the question of, you talked about interest, which I thought was a good point in response to the COP26. So I was wondering, if you had the ear of the right leaders in the liberal West, who would they be? And what would you be saying to them to do in the next year?
Well, there are. I mean, a couple of them are known. Most importantly, we don't know. Well, I mean, we can assume we know the leader, the next Chancellor of Germany, but they're not in place at the moment, and Germany's suffering at the moment because of the lack of that leadership. I think one of the problems we've got is that in Europe, the obvious leaders are not necessarily pulling together. And actually, Italy is an unusually positive story at the moment on that regard. I mean, Britain, I won't talk about in this setting. Macron, is a mixed bag with some very impressive calls, for example, on vaccines after a pretty unpromising start, but a tendency to go off in his own directions with his partners and neighbours not quite sure always what that means, and Germany still trying to sort itself out, and question marks about the durability of Biden as a person, and what the alternatives are in American politics. So I think we do have a problem of leadership at the moment. One never thinks the group of leaders one has at the time are up to the task, and looking back, they often seem to be giants. But I'm not quite sure we're going to look back at this period and feel that. And so I think there is a problem of leadership. But it is, as I said right at the end, one of the qualities of liberal democracies that they can refresh their leaders, and it's when they fail at that that they've got real problems. And I don't think, if you look at the statements from the G7 or so on, that they are unaware of the issues or talk about the wrong problems. I don't think that's the issue. The issue really is one of working out what initiatives you can take and making sure they happen. And for that, you really do need the Americans to sort themselves out. But you need the Germans as well, and I think we're waiting a bit on them.
Thank you very much. Barry, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Take my headphones off. Thank you, Laurie, for a quite masterful overview of the world situation in time, in space, in societies, and how you've demonstrated that seemingly disparate trends with respect to society, with respect to economies, with respect to globalization, with respect to values, all come together to try to help you understand the incredible complexity of modern society and modern security issues. Something you said that particularly struck in my mind was that you're saying that China wasn't interested in being balanced and comparing it with the Cold War. And I think that was a very, very interesting, very interesting comment that really did illustrate that we are in a different world. And I was also interested in your question about what conventional war would look like at the present time, given the fact that it is so long since we've had a conventional war. And one must share your optimism at the end that the problems of China and Russia, not least demonstrated today with the tennis player, which could well become a major negative for China, that in the long run, possibly liberal societies will prevail. Can I also take this opportunity as an alumnus to thank you for everything you've done for King's? You've joined a war studies department that was relatively small, as all our departments were when you and I joined, but you built it into an absolutely international powerhouse. And through your very and Diana referred to this at the outset, through your very public persona in terms of your comments in the media, the research that is based on, that you've done a tremendous amount for King's and establishing King's in the academic firmament. In a way, it just wasn't 25 years ago, whereas it now is an absolutely world-leading university, of which you are a not insignificant part of bringing it about, not least in terms of your leadership of research in King's over a period of years. So, so thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Diana, Diana seems to have left the recording. So, well, that seems to be the conclusion. Thank you ever so much, Laurie. That was great. Thank you.